All right, everyone. Welcome to November's open forum. I'm Dr. Hunter Peterson and the clinic director of Coeur d'Alene Healing Arts. And this is a long-standing lecture series I began in 2014 with my predecessor and mentor, Dr. Todd Schlapper, who founded this clinic. And now we are blessed to have done this we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary, and soon to have another doctor joining our team, Dr. Ari Weiner, who will probably be a participant in this along with Dr. Karen and Dr. Misty, our existing excellent doctors here. And so these meetings used to be in person. We've evolved them to virtual. And our effort here is to share our time in a dynamic space to talk about health and to bring forward a conversation about something of interest to our patients that can help them walk their health journeys. So I have prepared a topic today to speak about, but I also want to remind everybody that this is great to have as a dialogue, as a back and forth, as a share your questions with me, and I would love to respond to what you want to learn too. So practically speaking, using the chat feature is probably the best method to do so. So if you have questions, want a dialogue, let's get it in the chat and we'll pivot from there. Also, this is being recorded, so it will head up to our website by the end of this week or early next week for review and sharing with friends and family. cdahealingarts.com. So without further ado, I will launch into my topic, and we're going to talk about sugar today and its role in what I term the epidemic of chronic disease in our society. So I picked this topic for this period of the year because we're about on the precipice of going into a particular season known as the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's particularly, where we all relate to the prolific amounts of either liquid form or baked form of sugar and carbohydrates that much of our culture and society consumes. And so I thought, what better of a time to talk about what's that stuff really doing for our health? So, and maybe a slight, I guess, ulterior motive is to influence and convince some folks to shift some habits and patterning around some of their typical behavior. But mostly it's to be of educational value and to really help people truly understand this situation of our chronic disease epidemic and how sugar plays a role, as well as what the mechanism, what the physiology of that role is, getting into the details. And kind of what the path forward is for our own choices and maybe our society at large. So I want to kind of start with some really chilling figures. I guess really to give a much bigger zoomed out view of health as it has evolved for human beings is kind of interesting to look at, because if you look at causes of death, say 150 years ago compared to causes of death today, you would literally see a list of top 5 causes where nothing overlapped. So 150 years ago, you would have seen top causes of death being tuberculosis of the lungs. You would have seen dental abscesses. You would have seen like forms of infectious diarrhea, severe fevers or influenza, really acute infectious disease were the main drivers of and causes of death in our species up until very, very recently. We also didn't live as long. And then we had this advent of understanding hygiene better, and that really helped with infections. We knew how to wash things and keep things clean, a lot less infections. We also had the advent of some pretty powerful tools called antibiotics, which particularly with bacteria had this ability to knock out and kill infections that historically would have people would have succumbed to. So this is something that has really changed in the last 150 years. And what now we find as our top causes of death are complications of diabetes, strokes, heart attacks, cancer, probably to name the biggest ones, dementia as another one. And these tend to be the conditions that are the quote unquote causes of death. And notably, all of those conditions 150 years ago were acute diseases. Now, all of these conditions are chronic diseases, meaning they have a very slow development process and they quote unquote kill us very slowly. So things have radically shifted. And certainly it's worthwhile to cite the advent of antibiotics and hygienic practices as part of why acute infectious disease is so much less deadly now. But there's another variable that really deserves our attention, and that is the evolution of our nutrition, of the foods that we put in our body and the effects that they have on our health. So interestingly, over that 150-year span, that part of how human beings, what we eat, how much of what we eat has radically shifted. And I should really acknowledge and kind of narrow this down that really today I'm going to be referring to America, first world countries, but particularly our society, because that's what this conversation is relevant to. So it's true that developing countries or even European countries have quite different diets, quite different issues in regards to their nutrition situation. And so I don't want to stereotype our whole world, but largely we're going to talk about what is common to our society. And to get into that conversation, I guess first and foremost, I need to make the point about the epidemic part, right? So I think the title being Sugar Unmasking the Villain of America's Healthcare Crisis or Chronic Disease Epidemic. Really what I'm referring to is at this point of the 400 million or so people in the United States, over 50 million of them are type 2 diabetics. So 1 in 8 adults are type 2 diabetics. 1 out of every 3 adults have pre-diabetes. That includes people with diabetes plus all of the other people who have the beginning stages of diabetes. This is a condition where our blood sugar becomes increasingly dysregulated to the point where we have very unhealthy levels of sugar in our bloodstream, in our tissues. And there's just a gradational change basically between pre-diabetes and diabetes. And we're going to talk a lot about the effects of those blood sugar changes in a chronic disease setting today. Usually what comes along with that pre-diabetes or diabetes is weight gain. And we'll get into this as well, but there's a very important hormone called insulin that's heavily involved in this. And weight gain, when it's a certain amount overweight, we just use the term overweight. And then when we get a certain amount further overweight, we use the term obese. And then when we get even further overweight, we use the term morbidly obese. And we've gone on to connect both diabetes and obesity to many, many other chronic health conditions that are very destructive, cost our society a lot of money, and end up being the major causes of death in our society, namely heart disease, heart attacks, strokes, which are all part of heart disease presentations, dementia, kidney failure, and I mean, the list really goes on. We could talk about liver failure. We could talk about pretty much any organ system failing or being destroyed can be, as one of the primary, if not the single primary culprit, obesity and diabetes or blood sugar related issues being the underlying drivers. So we truly have this crisis in our society. I think the numbers I gave you is about 1 in 3 Americans are insulin resistant or pre-diabetic. And then we have 1 out of 3 Americans, or I think it's about 40%, being overweight. And that's all kind of mixed into this situation. Another term we'll often lump in here is the term metabolic syndrome, because we kind of acknowledge that some of these features come together. And what metabolic syndrome is defined by is a BMI over a certain amount, body mass index, height related to weight, waist size. It involves lipid or cholesterol levels and triglyceride levels, which are a big metabolic system in our body that's really connected to heart disease. It also involves blood sugar dysregulation, pre-diabetes, insulin resistance. These terms will be throwing around. And it also involves high blood pressure. As we gain weight, it takes more pressure to push the more blood through the more vessels we're making as we develop fat. And so literally one of the outcomes of obesity is that your blood pressure goes up. So these are all of the kind of phenomenon that contribute to this epidemic of chronic disease, namely diabetes, heart disease, and all the endpoint catastrophes that can happen in the body or destruction that can happen in the body's tissues. So we're really in a tough spot, and it really looks pretty bleak in terms of what the cost of all of this kind of runaway momentum with these conditions are, and the fact that over the last 50 years, it's just got worse and worse. The amount of pre-diabetes, the amount of diabetes, the amount of obesity has just continued to escalate. And alongside of that, what we have now come to find is that our healthcare system, to manage, to do sick care, as I call it, which is really how it's geared, is to treat diseases, not prevent them, is spiraling cost out of control to where it's not affordable to most Americans, and it's, truly bankrupting our society on many levels. And on top of that, throwing all that money at it, it's not working. We have, for the last 3 years consecutively, the human lifespan has gone down for 3 consecutive years. And this is pretty like really shattering the trends that have been in place for a very long time. Since the advent of hygiene and antibiotics 150 years ago, every single year human lifespan has increased with the advances of medicine. And finally, this reality of what we are putting in our bodies, how we're poisoning ourselves, has caught up to our capacity to live longer, and we're living shorter and shorter. And my argument, my hypothesis is it has to do with this exact fundamental that we're speaking about today, which is the role of sugar and things that break down sugar in our diet and in our health. So that's where I want to launch from. And I want to really start by stating something super clear and important about my approach to working with people on their health, is that I feel very clearly that the choices we make in our day-to-day life, the actions, the habits, the patterns that we inhabit are directly proportional to how our health evolves and presents, and what our vitality and longevity look like. I think our genetics have a very small role to play in the state of our health, a very notable role, but overall a small role. And I feel that the use of prescription medication, surgery, and supplements overall has a very minimal effect on the trajectory of our health. And I've come to increasingly believe in a more convincing way about this. So even though I use all of those tools regularly, what I'm passionate about, what I believe strongly about, and what I have found to be true in my life is the way that we habituate our daily care of ourselves is the most direct influencer of our vitality or longevity or health. And so today we're really going to be honing in on one aspect of that, which is nutritional. What food do we put in our body? I would say that nutrition is one of the principal determinants of health. There are many: sleep, exercise, movement, circulation, stress, emotional health, spiritual health, hydration, elimination, detoxification. These are core determinants of our health. Today, the focus is going to be on nutrition and how that determining force influences many, many possible outcomes to our health. So, starting to dive down that path, we bring forward the term sugar. And sugar is a molecule. There's many types of molecules of sugar. But ultimately, there's one type of molecule, really two, that is the kind of base building block that our body uses the most. They're called glucose and fructose. And so I'm first going to start about talking about the crucial role that sugar plays in our ability to exist. If we did not have sugar, we would die. If we were not able to access it, make it, or consume it, we could not exist. Our brain must run on sugar as its primary fuel source. Our tissues mostly rely on sugar as our primary fuel source. We'll call it their energy. We can use other types of energy, and I'll touch on that a little bit, but sugar is going to be the main one. And if we get even further into breakdown process, we have a term called glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. And if any of you on the lecture have had chemistry and biochemistry courses sometime in your life, you would have learned about these things. This is how inside of our body, particularly in our liver, but also in all of our tissues, we're able to break down glucose and fructose into essentially carbon dioxide and water, and that the energy that generates is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And ATP is the energy currency that allows us to exist. We would be dead if we didn't have this ATP energizing our life. That's on a very biochemical molecular level. So let me be very clear, we need sugar to exist. Like anything in life, it's all about the sweet spot, not too much, not too little. What our obesity and sugar epidemic is about is too much sugar. And so that's mostly what we're going to talk about, is what are the effects of when we put too much sugar in our bodies. And that is largely a phenomenon of modern society. And it's important to understand that right now, Americans are consuming on average every year 100 pounds of added sugars a year, actually 120 pounds of added sugars a year. Pounds, right? I mean, many of us on this call are not even 120 pounds in our total weight. That's how much sugar in a year, on top of all the other carbohydrates and natural sugars we're consuming on average. And so this disproportionate, enormous amount of sugar is basically on a biochemical level creating an excess of sugar, therefore an excess of energy, and our body doesn't know what to do with it. So it tries to store it, and it stores it, guess what, as fat. Thus the obesity epidemic. But eventually, and we'll get into why, that ability to store it efficiently breaks down, and we end up just having sugar in really high quantities everywhere, and we're not converting it and storing it and getting it out of the bloodstream. That turns out to be a really big deal and really, really bad for us. Another thing about our evolution that's very interesting in parallel to the ramped up increase of sugar is the dramatic plummeting of fiber intake. And it turns out that fiber has this kind of very health benefiting role. Well, excess sugar has this health negative role. Fiber, first of all, helps sugar go more slowly into our bloodstream when we consume carbohydrates or sugar with fiber. So that is something that exacerbates the sugar issue, the lack of fiber. Fiber also helps our gut be really healthy. And it turns out that, as the naturopathic physicians have known all along, our gut is really important to our health. It's really important as to the bugs that live there and how that shapes our immune system, how that shapes our absorption, how that shapes our brain even. Huge brain-gut connection. So all that fiber is really, really beneficial to healthy gut ecosystem. Our current standard American diet, I'll use that term standard American diet to just be a generalization, is consuming about 8 grams of fiber a day. Whereas our ancestral diet of 450 years ago was about 40 grams a day. So that's a dramatic decline. And fibrous foods, interestingly, it's a little confusing, but a fiber is technically a carbohydrate. But the trick about fiber is that it is not caloric, meaning we don't absorb it into our bloodstream. It stays in our gut. It binds up toxins. It feeds the bugs in our gut. But then it's what makes our poop healthy and bulky. And so that's part of how it gets all the toxins out, which is another crucial role it plays. But it also is something that goes kind of part and parcel with this change of the sugar epidemic, because what we have done is we've taken natural things that naturally have a little bit of sugar in them, but they have a lot of other nutrients and a lot of other beneficial components, and we've stripped all of that away. So really, when we talk about the sugar and obesity and chronic disease epidemic, we're really actually mostly talking about this term of processed food. And processed food is food that has been adulterated and essentially taken from its native form of how it would be harvested out in the wild or in agricultural cultivation, and basically stripping out all the fiber, and most of the nutrients to create a substance that is very either sweet or puffy or crunchy, to use really kind of layman's terms, that we are hardwired to crave, because our ancestral diet, because it was such a caloric or energy scarcity, we really are hardwired to crave things that are sweet and fatty. And the more intensely sweet and the more intensely fatty, the more we're hardwired to crave it. So in a kind of sinister way, we have basically stripped the nutrients down and essentially made foods that are not even real foods, that there are almost like anti-foods, because it takes nutrients and resources for your body just to metabolize these processed foods. So like to take a piece of white bread and break it down into energy, your body has to input a whole bunch of B vitamins and plant and kind of antioxidants and other minerals and vitamins to just access the energy from that. Whereas the ancestral sources, say a piece of whole grain, would have contained those B vitamins, contained those nutrients to help in its digestion. And it would have been loaded with a bunch more fiber too, with all of its other beneficial actions. So we've radically changed our food, and then we've started to eat this processed food, which again resembles nothing like the food you pick out in the wild or harvest in the wild. And essentially started to, if not exclusively, primarily consume these processed foods. And the tragedy is we're hardwired to crave them, and they are everywhere. Everywhere you look, there's, the grocery store. Like, this is a crazy thing. I tell people to shop on the edges of the grocery store, because literally 3/4 of the aisles are only processed foods, which have had the nutrients stripped out and often really concentrating the carbohydrates and the sugars. The vegetables are like, 1/50th of what's available in the grocery store, versus our ancestral diet was 80% fibrous and root vegetables. Now it's about 5%, right? Or less, a 50th, of the items in a store. We have fast food, we have on-the-go food, pre-prepared food. It's all processed. And it all has these qualities of high sugar, low quality, high amounts of fat, and high amounts of processed carbohydrates. So this is resulting in all of these epidemic chronic diseases that we're talking about: obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease. This at a core level, my theory is that this is the number one culprit. It's not even my theory. I mean, public health experts widely agree about this. So let's talk for a little bit about what really goes on at the cellular level with this, so you can understand it. Let's use the example of eating a piece of toast with jam on it. Jam being like maybe like a refined, processed jam with extra added sugar. So when you eat that piece of toast, it goes down into your stomach. That's where protein digestion happens, and there's not much protein in that food, so it's going to go into your small intestine, and then it's going to be chopped apart by enzymes. And let's use the toast and the let's just say it's whole grain toast, for example. Let's use that separate from the jam. So the first thing that happens is you break down that bread into fiber as one component of carbohydrate, and then starch as the other component of carbohydrate. So remember, the fiber doesn't absorb, it doesn't go into your bloodstream, and it actually slows how fast sugar and starch absorb into your bloodstream. So it's a good thing. So that gets cleaved off and goes through the system. The starchy part are these big long molecules called polysaccharides, and enzymes start to chop that down until it chops it all the way down to glucose and fructose. And that is the base unit that gets absorbed into your bloodstream. And our guts have mechanisms to absorb that glucose into the bloodstream. But before all of it gets absorbed, some of it's going to get chewed up by the gut flora. And it turns out that the bugs in our gut, the kind we don't want hanging around, they really like eating those carbohydrates, particularly those polysaccharides. And they are able to steal them away and start to eat them and proliferate. So one of the big issues with sugar is it doesn't just make us gain weight and have too high blood sugar and have too much cholesterol. It also gives us a lot of inflammation. And one of the main mechanisms of inflammation is that those high starch foods feed bacteria and microbes in our gut that when there's too much of them, they're very destructive, inflammatory, and that carries into our bodies and tissues, because that's right where our immune system is interfacing, is with those bugs in our gut. And so that's a big generator of inflammation in its own right, not just the sugar in the bloodstream, which we'll get to in a second. So anyways, that bread, as it's broken all the way down to glucose and fructose, absorbs into the bloodstream. And the jam, which is basically the same story, there's not much fiber in it. Fiber gets separated off. It's already broken down into sugar. So it goes into the bloodstream too. So now you have this kind of big, I'll say the medical term is bolus, but a big chunk of glucose and fructose floating into your bloodstream. The first place it goes is your liver. And in the liver, this is kind of like our master metabolic organ. So the liver is really what kind of takes all of the raw ingredients and it packages them up and starts to form them into a finished product. And so first, before we get too heavy-handed into the liver's action, we got to talk about what the conductor is of all of this. And so after we eat that meal, those are some other cues that make us choose what to eat, how much to eat. Kind of, we'll spend a minute on that. But once the food is in the bloodstream, then there are some hormonal systems that take over. And the big hormone to talk most about today is the hormone insulin. We've all heard that term probably. We call it the hormone of the fed state. And what we mean by that is that when the body, particularly with sugar, carbohydrates, gets an input into the bloodstream, it says, oh, great, we have plenty of energy around. Let's go about getting that stored up so that when we're in a long fasting state, then we can liberate that stored energy and use it to fuel us. Remember, the body needs sugar to exist. All of our tissues are dependent on it. So we have this very elegant system of packaging it for storage and liberating it for use. And we have kind of short-term storage facilities. We have long-term storage facilities. So the short-term storage facility is this molecule called glycogen. And so one of the things when we're in a fed state, the insulin says, okay, liver, let's make a bunch of glycogen. And it stores this pretty easy to liberate energy for, the next 24 hours. So once it's topped off its glycogen, it then starts to shuttle that energy down a different pathway called triglycerides, which are one of the main constituents of cholesterol. And so if there's excess energy and the insulin signal's nice and strong, it's going to start to generate these triglycerides. And then those triglycerides go into the bloodstream and they mobilize into the tissues, and they actually get deposited via this cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. That's the connected type of cholesterol to this process, which is the bad cholesterol. It gets shuttled into cells and tissues and eventually gets stored as we call it just fat storage. Triglyceride is the smallest constituent of fat. And so if we put a lot of energy in and we put a lot of excessive amounts, versus the energy we're trying to break down and use, i.e. if we're really lazy and sedentary and not moving a bunch, we're consuming a lot of calories, especially if they're calories from glucose, then we're going to end up storing a lot of that as fat. Because it's interesting, sugar or carbohydrate is the main signal to turn on this insulin. So it's a little bit of a paradox that we think, oh, well, don't we get fat because we eat fat? It's true that you can store fat that's dietary, but it's done through a different mechanism. And it's actually, interestingly, a lot harder to get obese by just eating fat. It's usually the combo of fat and sugar that is what drives that accumulation of excess weight. So we're going to focus mostly on the carbohydrates today, and partly that's because if you actually look at us society-wide, what's changed dramatically, aside from a plummeting of fiber and vegetable and whole fruit intake over the last 150 years, is a radical increase in starch and sugar, especially in the processed forms. Fat has increased, but not as dramatically. The bigger problem with fat increase is the type of fats. We're using a lot lower quality fats. And those have much more problematic health issues with them, which we won't get into much today. If we come back to the sugar and the carbohydrates and the fat storage, how that process all evolves, we can see pretty clearly that when we are flooding our system with refined carbohydrates, we end up really putting a lot of insulin hormone out into the body, and we end up turning a really strong signal on to essentially make and store fat, which is partly why this obesity thing is so epidemic. Another thing that the insulin does that's a very crucial role it plays is sugar doesn't just get repackaged in the liver. It actually in the bloodstream goes to all the tissues, and it gets shuttled from the bloodstream into the cell to actually be broken down into ATP just right there in the cell. So, there's a process to break down the fat and then turn that into ATP, and that's why our body makes fat for storage. But it also, we constantly have this circulating blood sugar, and that sugar is being dropped into the cells to give them to allow them to make the energy they need. And it turns out that insulin is the hormonal signal that signals that transfer of sugar from the bloodstream to the cell. So this is a really crucial understanding when we get to the next big deal about sugar, which is its tendency in our society. As we see, I mentioned 1 out of 3 adults have at least prediabetes. What that means is that our body is slipping or losing ground in its ability to regulate our blood sugar at a steady state. And for the vast majority of Americans, the actual mechanistic issue is that at the cellular level, where that insulin facilitates the shuttle of sugar from the bloodstream into the cell, that system is breaking down, and the cells are no longer responding to the signal of insulin. And that signal loss worsens the more sugar we eat, the older we get, and the more fat we get, that those signaling responses break down further and further. And so early on, our blood sugars may stay the same, but our insulin levels may go way up. Eventually, our insulin levels are way up, but it's no longer keeping the sugar out of the bloodstream, and the blood sugar goes up and up and up. And then if that really progresses and you don't do anything about it, and it goes on for years and years, your pancreas, which is what makes the insulin hormone, gets exhausted, and it stops being able to make insulin anymore. And that's what we call late onset diabetes type 1, which is a form of diabetes where you don't make any insulin because you've exhausted your pancreas. So this phenomenon is going on at a mechanistic biochemical level in epidemic proportions in our society. And the really tragic thing and scary thing about it is that we don't know what's going on. It's pretty invisible. We can't really feel its effects because it's this very slow creeping effect. It's essentially this invisible phenomenon. I use this metaphor a lot with food sensitivities. When we eat a food we're sensitive to, we don't notice it affecting how we feel because we're already putting it in our bodies really regularly most of the time. So it's like if you're driving on the freeway going 80 miles an hour and you go up to 81, you don't feel a change in your speed, even though you're definitely changing speed because you've already got this underlying speed going. So same thing with blood sugar, it creeps up so slowly that we just don't notice the shift in how it affects us and how we feel. And so one of the tragedies about this epidemic with blood sugar particularly is people don't know they've really got issues developing. And to aggravate matters, the medical community isn't very on top of this. They're not doing a very good job screening for this and really being proactive about catching people in early stages of this, partly because it's an overwhelmed system, partly because it's a profit-driven system, and probably partly because it's a disease-driven model of care, meaning, well, we don't do anything about it until it's officially a disease. And my argument is that we don't want to wait till it's disease to start doing something because damage has already been done at that point, especially because it's probably been going on for many years. So that insulin resistance phenomenon we're talking about and the creeping up of the blood sugar, because it's kind of hard to pick up on it symptomatically, although you totally can. One of the classic symptoms of this is fatigue after meals, particularly about an hour after meals. What's happening there is you flooded your body with sugar, glucose. You've then flooded your body thereafter with insulin, and it's crashed your blood sugar by about an hour after the meal, and so low that in fact you feel exhausted. So if you notice that sensation, that's a pretty clear, kind of hint that you may have one of these metabolic issues. Another really obvious one is this whole thing we've been talking about in relation to insulin as the hormone of the fed state and the creation and storage of fat. If you're notably overweight, you probably got this issue going on. And especially if you're carrying that weight in your abdomen, in your viscera, like over the trunk of your body versus down in your legs and hips and butt, that is true because of that mechanism I talked about around insulin resistance. Remember how I said the insulin stops working to move sugar from the bloodstream into the cell? That has to be that is exacerbated greatly by the accumulation of fat in the visceral tissue, which is where all your metabolic organs are. So when you have fat infiltration, that insulin resistance mechanism really starts to break down quicker. So those are some of the signs that are more obvious about a blood sugar issue symptomatically. But the other way to become really clear about it is testing. You can test your blood sugar really easily. You can buy a glucometer, which is a little finger poke machine, and a reader online for $20. You can buy the strips for 20 cents a strip, and you can check your blood sugar any time of day. If you have a fasting blood sugar, morning blood sugar above 100, before you've eaten anything, you probably got something going on here with your blood sugars. You can have your blood drawn and not only get a fasting blood sugar, but you can get a hemoglobin A1C, which is an average blood sugar, kind of like a 3-month average approximately of what your blood sugar was. Incredible way to check the degree to which your blood sugar is at an optimal level versus creeping up into a too high of an average. You can also check your insulin levels. And so these are the types of things that I will do on my patients to thoroughly screen them. And cholesterol fits into the puzzle pieces too, as we mentioned, because cholesterol is intimately tied to this blood sugar metabolism conversation. So these are things you can regularly, routinely check. And if you don't, not seeing a naturopath like me, you can kind of demand of your other providers, at least get a hemoglobin A1C to see where your average blood sugars are. There's been some really pretty compelling research done that essentially every 1/10 of a point, your hemoglobin A1C is above 5.0, you double your risk of cardiovascular disease and dementia. So in 1/10 of the point is equal to like 3 or 4 points of glucose. So an optimal blood glucose is between 90 and 100. So every 1/10 of a point or 3 or 4 points you increase that, your long-term risk of these very serious diseases increases, doubles. And that's why people talk about heart disease and dementia as like, basically in large part driven by diabetes, blood sugar issues. The other mechanism of that I didn't talk about is the destructiveness of too much sugar in the bloodstream. And that has to do with this concept of oxidation and reduction. And what we really mean by that is the body is constantly basically doing this process of regenerating tissue through reduction, adding electrons, and then subtracting them, and that's called oxidation. And basically these reduction oxidation reactions are a very fundamental part of our health. Like our whole immune system operates off of oxidative processes that kill pathogens. When we make energy, we generate oxidative species to do so. So this is a very necessary part of health, but we're also in a complementary way reducing things and reversing that oxidation. So it's all about balance. And when we eat excessive amounts of sugar, turns out that, or put too much sugar in our bloodstream, it turns out that sugar is highly oxidative, meaning it does a lot of oxidizing of our tissues in an imbalanced way, too fast for us to reduce and repair that oxidation. And there's a term also called glycation that is associated with that, which literally glycation is from the root word that sugar comes from. And so that process of oxidation is highly damaging to tissue when done in too high of concentrations out of balance. And so we talk about the average blood sugar rising, or we talk about blood sugar numbers up above 200 or up above 300. We're doing damage to our tissues. But again, the very tragic part about it is it's kind of invisible. We don't feel that damage. And so we don't know we're doing something harmful. But nevertheless, when you spread that out chronically over days, weeks, months, years, and decades, that excessive oxidative damage really takes a toll. And that's why we have these chronic degenerative processes that happen in the case of the cardiovascular system, in the brain, and the neurological system, in the kidneys. We're literally slowly but surely damaging away, breaking down those tissues and aging them prematurely. So that is the ultimate tragedy of this sugar epidemic and what it precipitates. So being that we are rounding out our time here and have about 5 minutes left, I want to kind of take this home here to really say, okay, what do we do about this issue? What are our choices? Well, first of all, do some screening if you're an adult, and tell your friends about the types of screening you can do to get a gauge on all of this. I should also mention one other tool, which you can even get a continuous glucose monitor now, which is a way to measure your blood sugar continuously, and these not even that expensive. But you can do finger pokes, you can go have your hemoglobin A1C drawn, you can have your fasting blood sugar, you can have your cholesterol, you can look at all these numbers and get educated. And obviously doing it with a naturopathic physician, you can get much more precise and much more proactive about it. But also you can just look at the fundamentals of it and say, okay, we've strayed really far away from our evolutionary design, and we need to return to our natural state of what we're designed to consume and run our best on. And that means that we work toward making a more solid, resolute commitment away from processed foods, particularly processed carbohydrates, because of this vicious, nasty cycle they create with what it does to our tissues and how it's contributing to these epidemic chronic diseases. So when I say processed food, I just really mean stuff that doesn't look like the plant or natural state it came from. So breads, pastas, chips, crackers, candy, baked goods, processed drinks that are sugar laden, including alcohol, but of course, juices and sodas and candies and all of these worlds of things. I almost don't want to like belabor this. We know what processed foods are: tortillas, bagels, cereals, right? Like where the nutrients and the fiber has been stripped out and they taste sweet or crunchy, and really dramatically reduce our use of those foods. And to take up their place, prepare our own foods at home, consume more fibrous vegetables, consume more root vegetables, consume more whole fruits, consume more clean, grass-fed, farm-raised meats and animal products. These are the ways that as a society we can transform this epidemic. And that's really the core way to do so. One other vein that of course we can talk about is exercise. You could eat pretty poorly and eat a lot of processed food if you were exercising intensively 2 to 3 hours a day. Now you'd probably become pretty deficient in some key nutrients, because not eating live nutrient-rich food, you're going to become depleted. But you can create enough of a demand at the cellular level to not create all of these insulin issues and blood sugar issues, because you just burn right through that energy. Generally, that's 99% of us not realistic for what our lives look like. And we're going to need to do a combo of exercising and selecting real food. And so that is really the way out of this as a society. Of course, it's much more complex than just knowledge, but even the knowledge, that's an assumption that people have access to a conversation like we're having, or the means to do anything about it. Tragically, we have subsidized our agricultural system and basically made it cheap to access processed food. So in addition to being hardwired to crave it, it's the most affordable thing. It's more affordable than eating vegetables. So it's creating this setup that's almost impossible to overcome, in that socioeconomically, demographically, people can't afford to eat healthy, nor do they have the education to see its importance, nor is the society telling them that it's important. And so we are in a really difficult position as a society. But my philosophy about life and my kind of spiritual orientation is that the way that we can meet all of this suffering and all of this scary future is choose to heal ourselves and then heal others. So I guess that's what I'll leave you with, is this is a choice you can make. This is a choice that you can be in a convicted, resolved way to seek to nurture this practice of let your food be thy medicine, and work and break away from some habits that are unserving. If you can do that with yourself, people are going to pay attention. People are going to want to know what's helping you, and that will inevitably influence them over time to make different choices. And if we can each individually take our part and do our part and own our part in that collective work, then that's how we can heal our society. And I think that's where we all have to start. So you'll notice that I did not talk about a lot of natural medicines to combat diabetes, blood sugar issues. We didn't talk about drugs like metformin, or the big hot one now is Ozempic, which is a really nasty wild drug that apparently we're handing out like candy as the new cure-all for obesity. These are not the answers. These are not what's going to get us away from the model of sick care. So I truly hope that we can really take this food as medicine understanding, this empowerment of knowledge, and this kind of choice we have around what we put in our body to do real good, and in doing so for ourselves, then extend that and do so for our society bit by bit. So I thank you for popping on. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then